Welcome back to the table, everyone. For this next video, we're going to talk a little bit about the counters. These represent whether it's status markers for game effects, administrative markers, or the combat units themselves. There's a lot of counters in the game, from simple trucks all the way out to Bradley fighting vehicles, wrecks, tanks, troop transports, werewolves. So there's quite a few that you'll have. Now for this very particular scenario, this again is scenario 3 from the campaign book, The Ambush. This is all the counters that you need. Well, you might need a couple more of the disrupted and the fired markers. We'll talk about those first. Well, that was more dramatic in my head than in practice. Now, as far as the administrative markers go, there are a few. Now, one of the important ones will be disrupted. This is one of the counters we use for tracking combat damage. They are double-sided. So one thing to be aware of, depending on how you prepare your counters, is a way to track moved and fired markers to keep them separate from just a pile of disrupted. In fact, even some of the wreck markers are going to have fired, and some will have, oh, that was another fired. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you're looking through your initial counter, stack of counter sheets, and you don't find fired or moved, might need to flip it over so you can check the back side of the disrupted. So they are kind of dual purpose, and there's enough that you should be able to get through every situation that you'll have in the game. And again, these are mostly just to mark the action that the unit has taken, or if it's been disrupted from combat. So there's an example of some of the administrative markers that you'll need to play the scenario. Another administrative marker that's good to have on hand is the game turn tracker. As you move along, maybe I said game turn tracker. Well, I mean, this is the track, but here's the counter for the tracker. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And you'll just be able to flip it to whoever has initiative according to the game. So in our example, we'll have it on the Soviet side first. They'll go first. And then as we progress and we roll for initiative, we can flip it as necessary or keep it there. So that's another important administrative marker to have, so I'll set that off to the side. Then a couple other administrative markers that you'll need to find for the Soviet player are the aid, I guess we put it that way, aid and focus marker. Now we'll actually talk about the aid and focus step and things that you can do with these, but essentially these are opportunities for you to play field commander and influence the battle in some capacity. The NATO player and the Soviet player are the only ones with aid and focus. All the other factions, zombies, werewolves, vampires, etc., they do not get an aid and focus marker. Now, important to note is that there's two sides to this as well. So for example, on the front side, there is a 1 die icon. On the back is a 2 die icon. What that represents is how many dice rolls this counter will allow you to have for that function. And it doesn't go any higher. So if you're on the 2, it won't go higher than 2. However, if you spend one of these die, if you will, for a reroll, you could flip it to the 1 side. And then once you roll that 1, you would remove that from the board. So there's your aid and focus. They are also double-sided, and we'll set those aside. So don't forget to include those when you play. Let's look at some of the combat units. So we'll just grab a tank first. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit on that one for you. Could probably zoom in closer, but let's go with this. Now, all of these are going to have a title at the top. So here's a T-64B. One thing to remember, and why it's not indicated on the counter, is this is a platoon level game. Therefore, all of these vehicle counters and even infantry counters represent more than, say, one vehicle or a typical 10-person squad. You're going to have 3 to 4 vehicles and then 30 to 40 people in your platoon or more, depending on how it's made up. But just realize these represent multiple people. Even if you were to look at the champions, the heroes, they don't represent just a singular person. This could represent the main character with a couple of assistants, or the posse, the people that hang out with that person. So even these individuals are not necessarily alone. All right, so let's get back to this platoon counter for tanks. What you have are some values on here that represent various aspects that you'll need for combat. Maybe I will zoom in just a little bit more. There we go. That works pretty good. Let's go with that. So you'll see that this number is going to represent a value of strength, is a good way to put it. So this is a strength 10, and this specific number represents the anti-armor value, like the armor piercing value, if you will, armor penetration factor. And the yellow box, and you'll see some of these other units have boxes with different colors, represents the range at which it can fire, which we'll go in more detail when we do combat. But that brings us back to that first play aid, where, for example, we could see that yellow short range is 2 hexes away, normal range is out to 5 hexes, and long range is out to 10, and you can't go beyond. So that's the combat strength and the range in one little symbol. Down here in the lower left is the high explosive factor, what you would use against the unarmored vehicles, trucks, leg units, etc. And you'll see it's listed very similarly. There's a strength value, 10 for this one, and again a yellow box which shows the range. Also, sometimes you'll notice there's a little subscript, and that can be a little tricky at first, but it's actually very, very simple. It's a die roll modifier when you combat, and we'll be able to show that when we get the pieces on the board and they're fighting. But essentially it just means when I roll to see how many hits I've got, I just simply add, or some of these will have a subtraction from that die roll, and then they could possibly cancel out. For example, up here in the upper right hand corner we have the armor value, kind of the defensive value of this vehicle. If it has a value, then you know it's armored. If there's no value, let's grab a truck. Yeah, they're pretty much not. And they even have a penalty to the armor, which is actually an addition. So if a armored unit was to fire at this truck, when you add a negative, it's kind of weird, but you're applying this. It's an addition to it's math. Anyway, you'll see that here's a better example, less math. No armored value, so you know that this is a leg unit. Trucks, we'll just say trucks are that special case where they can either be shot at using an armored penetration value, or they could be shot at using high explosive value that you would normally use against infantry. So they're unarmored but can be shot at by both, which is why it has a really crummy armor factor. It's because it's supposed to be easy to blow up. But here, no factor, because leg units, soft, squishy people, have no armor value. Now, here, speaking of that little subscript number, is a -1. And that's actually kind of interesting, if you will, because when you roll the die 10, the lower your number, the better the combat result, because the way the combat chart works is the lower number you roll, potentially more damage that you do. So that means when somebody shoots at this tank, its armor isn't quite as strong as, say, equivalent vehicles. And that's what these little subscript numbers allow us to do, is to kind of tweak the values on armor or firepower to kind of reflect within the world that certain vehicles might not be quite the same material. Like, if two vehicles had 64 millimeters of armor, maybe this is not quite as good quality steel as, say, another vehicle which has no modifier. So we could have gone in and made very specific rules for each type of vehicle, but what we found was just by applying a little tiny modifier, that allows us to tweak these special circumstances without having to include complicated rules. So that's what the little subscript is. It's a die roll modifier for combat. Great. Down here in the lower left is your close assault factor. So when you're doing your close combat, you'll notice that many of these have a value, even the truck. So you'll see that tanks, they can use their coaxial machine guns, and this is kind of a representation of that. They probably wouldn't use the main gun up close very much, but they do have some defensive machine guns. Now you'll notice that infantry have a very good close assault factor. When they are attacking vehicles, this represents, without the need of actually adding it, things like maybe Molotov cocktails, anti-tank grenades, and things like that. So infantry, they can be very good against armored vehicles, as indicated by their close assault factor there. Now, just in general, their high explosive factor for infantry in this case is 6. That's still pretty good for shooting across a couple hexes at other infantry. However, much weaker in this case for their armor value. Black means adjacent, so they don't have much range. And that again would be maybe improvised weapons, inherent RPG values, things like that. But they got to be pretty close. But if they get in to combat, they can't actually enter the hex, but if they were to get into combat, close assault combat with that tank unit, they can hold themselves pretty well. So just kind of keep that in mind. You don't necessarily want to send tanks just directly against infantry. Infantry are not squishy in this game. Alright, one last value here, movement. This is pretty important, I wanted to show you. So this is the movement factor. Typically, one open hex of terrain costs 1 movement factor. So this tank could go 5 hexes of open terrain. Then modified by the terrain effects chart, which we briefly looked at in our first video. So it's zoomed in, maybe you can actually read this now. So for example, forest. This was the little sub-note, a 2, and the sub-note down here just reminded us that there is the woods create 1 hex shadow immediately behind terrain when sighted from a hill. And always just to remind yourselves of the terrain, just read the special notes when you find a little sub-note. Then for movement, leg units, only 1 movement factor to go through woods, no problem. But vehicles, 2 movement factors. So tanks going through woods are a little bit slower. Infantry are going to move much quicker through woods. Perfect. That sounds good to me. Now you'll notice that, and yeah, here's a good example. Bring some more examples. And I had one. I got this. This one is not part of the scenario, but I wanted to show this one since we're looking at values. Thought this would be fun to show. You'll see that on some of these counters, let's grab another one here. Oh, let's not forget this asterisk. This asterisk in the close assault box means that that unit cannot initiate close assault. So if it's attacked, it can defend itself with a value of 1, but you're not going to be able to try and run people over with the truck. Sorry. Alright, but let's take a look. We won't worry about the yellow bands around this. That's something we can look at later when we talk about combat more specifically, but that yellow box does have meaning. Well, shoot. I can point this R out though. It doesn't have anything to do with combat and probably won't have any effect on this particular scenario. But this R means it's a recon capable unit, which gives some assistance with artillery barrages, things like that. Also, this A would represent advanced targeting. That does affect combat. so we won't discuss that immediately. None of the counters in this game will have this particular scenario have this advanced targeting, so we'll discuss that maybe in a separate video. So what is important I wanted to show you was the circle around the movement in this little rifle. That tells us that this is a infantry carrying capable vehicle, and typically they are going to carry 1 unit worth of infantry, which is pretty simple. You just stick the infantry on the bottom and the vehicle on top, and that means they're loaded up, ready to go. Great. Then this one might be a little tricky to see on the camera, but I wanted to show you an example since we were talking about that circle. Normally, a recon vehicle can only carry recon infantry. Recon infantry tend to be smaller squad sizes. They aren't a full combat capable squad, so it's a few people that can dismount and go out and sneak around and scout a little bit. So they will be a circled dash around the movement number. So another way to remind you that yes, this vehicle is capable of carrying infantry, but this particular one, because of the dashed circle, can only carry recon infantry. Whereas the truck, it's a solid circle, so that means it can carry regular infantry. Last thing about movement that we'll mention, and it may come up, is if there is a burst behind the movement number, that tells us that this unit is capable of conducting moving fire. And I didn't have a red one for this scenario, but we'll just mention it here. There is on our combat chart, it tells us here that if the burst, here you go, if the burst is orange, there's a 1 column shift to the left. That benefits the defender because it's harder to hit stuff while you're moving. But if it's a blue explosion, it's a 2 column shift to the left. So for example, the Abrams will always have an orange because they have very advanced gyro stabilization for their guns, and so they have an easier time moving and firing. And then blue might be some of the older Soviet equipment you might encounter where they can fire on the move, but it's a little less accurate. This tells us that Ledetta can fire on the move, and she only suffers a 1. Last thing we'll talk about, because there's a few here, is on your counter, some of them will have these special icons that represent various abilities that that unit has. That's kind of unique to that unit. So what we'll do is we'll just say here, for example, the dice. Now this is why these cards are real important, is because they have the reference on them. The rulebook also has a full listing of all the different types of icons that you might encounter. And for example, here Tintani has quite a few, and all you would have to do is when you're playing Tintani is match up the symbol, and it's in the order too of explanation, so that should be useful. So this top one is Wolf Speed, this next one is Fearsome Howl, then you have Regenerate, and then you have Frenzied, and then an explanation of it. So for example, Wolf Speed, opportunity fire attacks against Tintani receive a 2 column shift left. Whenever Tintani enters assault combat, the odds are shifted 2 columns to the right. Wow, he's fast. And we won't bore you by reading all of those, but as we use them in the scenario, we'll be able to draw attention to them and show what they mean. And that's pretty much it. I think maybe one thing to point out to help you is if the counter has a graphic of a vehicle, that tends to be an armored fighting vehicle. If it has a picture, more importantly, a NATO symbol behind it, that typically indicates infantry or an unarmored combatant of some sort. Here's an M for militia. Now the heroes are leg units. They don't have a NATO symbol because they really don't have a NATO symbol yet for werewolves, vampires, but that could come. And then there's a NATO symbol for the RPG, again indicating not an armored fighting vehicle. Now to wrap this particular little video up, it's starting to get a little lengthy. Just to show you who the combatants are for this scenario. Bradley goes away. We'll lift it up a little bit. We're going to have 4 trucks. Got the trucks here. There's, for the Soviet player, 4 trucks. There are 3 infantry units. There will be 3 BTRs and 3 BRDM2s, BTR 70s, 3 T-64Bs, so there's your BTR, BRDM, another BRDM, truck, almost got him, boom, there you go. That will be the Soviet makeup, low counter density, that's great to get you started with. Then for the Lycan player, you'll have Lidetta in her kind of non-werewolf form, and then she'll have a counter for when she meets the requirements. She'll change into a Lycan, so there she is. And then there's Tantani, that will come in later. Now you get 3 militia units. Those are the what we call the youngers, the ones that can't change at will or through like a card. Then they have 1 RPG unit, 1 RPD unit, and oh, I had them mixed up. There's Lidetta's werewolf form, and then there's a Lycan. There you go. And that will make up the werewolf force. So again, this is a great scenario if you're starting out. Not a super high counter density, but enough to let you move things around on the table. The next video we do, we'll talk about how to place these on the map, how they stack, and then we can start playing the game. So I appreciate you watching, and I hope that this is helping you make sense of the game and the components that you're playing with. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you around.